In 1 Timothy 4, verse 13, Paul wrote, "Till I come, give attendance to reading, to exhortation, to doctrine." We quote that verse here at the outset of this portion of our worship, which is giving attention to the reading of the Scriptures. This is what he had in mind. All those who've studied this realize that in the context, he's talking about the Bible. Read the Bible. And he's talking about reading in the formal sense in an assembly like this. This is what we're doing. We've read some portions of the Bible. We'll look at a few more this morning. And we'll try to understand what they're saying to us. We will try to understand how they can make our lives better. That's why we're here. It's very simple. Now, we're not living in an age that looks at the world in the way we do. We're talking about reading books, reading words on a page. Our world, as we were discussing a moment ago in Bible class, is very visually oriented. Pictures matter more than anything to most in our time. So, what is the image? That's what concerns me. What is the image? We forget just how artificial our world really is. How shallow, too. Life does not consist in the things that I can see dancing images on a telephone screen or at my computer. Life consists in realities that are beyond the pale of our own vision. We can know things are out there, though we now will not see them and cannot see them here in the body. How do we know? There are many indications that our Maker has left for us. But some of the most powerful are found right here in this sacred text. This is why he tells us when we come together, give attention or give attendance to reading along with the doctrine and exhortation. You see, the exhortation is what you do when you read and you explain, then you exhort. Hey, let's follow the teachings of this verse, of these verses. This is what we want to do today. Now, this lesson you can see from what Chris just read for us from Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verses 9 and 10 down to chapter 12 and verse 1. It's addressed to young people. Who are the young people? Well, some things are obvious. We have some younger than others. We have the youngest, and we have some who are probably older, maybe the oldest. We won't get into all that, but that is in a way a relative term, whether you're young or old. Depends on the group with which you're associated. It really depends on a lot of factors. Back in biblical times, I'm not talking about the patriarchal era when they lived spectacularly long lives. I mean, after the race became quite degenerate because of sin and sin's consequences, and sicknesses and infirmities entered into our genetic makeup, life was not long. Now, some live to be ripe old ages of, 70 and 80 years old, but it was not a common thing. Death was so common, whether from accidents or from just ill health. The things that today are not really a big deal, to them were. You cut your finger or you skin your knee. In our time, that's pretty easy. You have antibiotics, you clean it up, and you don't worry about it a lot. In their day, you could get septic blood and die within a matter of a few days. And so there were so many things that could destroy the lives of the ancients that to live to be 21 years old was a pretty big deal. To live to be 30 or 40 was a much bigger deal. Well, I say all that to remind us, when we talk about youth, it's relative. So this lesson really applies to everyone sitting in this room. As long as we're still alive, we're still younger than we will be at the moment we're gone. So we're talking about how to apply these principles to our age. And this is a book that fascinates me. In a way, it's one of my favorites, especially from the Old Testament. It has been misunderstood and sometimes abused. Some have charged it with pessimism, the Book of Ecclesiastes. I don't think that really understands what the writer was all about. I think the wise man does just what he tells us he set out to do. In the beginning of the book, he narrates how he wanted to find out what it is good for the sons of men to do under the sun. Now, that quaint expression just means all people. What's a good thing for all humanity to do, no matter where you are, who you are? to do in this life, because that's what the expression under the sun means. And think about how that could be literally the case. We're now under the sun. We're out here in this world, the physical world, before we die. This is what it means. And we all will die. As the Bible clearly recognizes, Hebrews 9:27, it is appointed a man once to die, but after this the judgment. But before that happens, how do I live the good life? And he had every ability to find out. So that's what the book's about. We're not going to go into that in great depth, but just remind ourselves, after exploring all these avenues that people typically explore in our world and always have to try to make their lives happy and fulfilled, nothing really quite worked until he got to the end of it. And now he's winding up all of his findings after his long odyssey, after his long experimentation. So he begins now in chapter 11 and in verse 9, and he says, "Rejoice, O young man." And of course we know that would apply to either gender. "Rejoice, O young man," or "O young woman, in thy youth." Just be happy you're young. And the youngest could especially be, and those who are a little bit older can also be, and those who are the oldest can still be. We can still be happy that we are relatively young. And then he goes on to say, "Let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth." Be happy within yourself. Be contented. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. In other words, make the choices that you believe will make you happy. But know thou that for all these things God will bring them to judgment. So this is verse 9, and this is the first major point from our simple study this morning. He tells us to rejoice in our youth. And then he explains how we do that, making these decisions. There are some who wonder how the author meant this. And there are two basic ways people look at it. The commentators say, no, he's just being facetious. He's being ironic. That's one view. He really doesn't mean this. He's warning us. He's just saying, you go ahead and do what you want to do while you're young. Just make your own way in life. Make your own choices. Being kind of ironic, saying that with a wink, as it were. And he really didn't mean it. The other point of view is, no, he really means it. While you're young and you have the power of decision, you have many options available, many of which are closed when you get older. Make those choices that will make yourself happy, because you can do that. Enjoy your life and be thankful for God's gift of being young and being alive. And, even in the case of many, being healthy. Now, I think that latter is probably the right approach. And it sort of fits in with other things the wise man says in the book. For example, in Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 18, "It is good and comely for one to eat and to drink, and to enjoy the good of all his labor, which God hath given him under the sun. For this is his portion." And those who work and get up every day early to go out to make a living, all who've done that, and everybody here will or has already done that, realize that there is a reward after a hard day's work. We may be tired, but we know we're able to enjoy these things. By the way, this is a plug for what we call capitalism, or ownership of private property. Some things you earn, you can enjoy those things. You have right to them. But that's not what we're looking at. We're just looking at how he's just probably saying, yeah, you go ahead and make these decisions. Your youth can be a time of enjoyment, but remember, while you have freedom of will to make these decisions, there will be consequences for those decisions. Know thou that God will bring thee into judgment. Judgment is a recurring theme in this last part of the book of Ecclesiastes. Rejoice, but be realistic. And that's the message I want to leave with every one of us. If we get nothing else, it's this. We ought to be happy with what God blesses us with. At the same time, we've got to be realists and know what could happen, what will happen to many. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, just a little bit later on, is going to sum it all up. Verses 13 and 14. "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil." Now that's one of the best summaries you can find about judgment anywhere in Scripture. And it coincides with what's taught later when the New Testament comes along and we have a fuller understanding of God's will and his revelation. Paul would say to the Athenians, for example, Acts 17 verses 30 and 31, "In the times of this ignorance God winked at, but now commandeth all men everywhere to repent, because He hath appointed a day in the which he will judge the world in righteousness by that man whom he hath ordained, whereof he hath given assurance unto all men, in that he hath raised him from the dead. The apologetic evidence is there. What God says is true, and when he warns about a judgment to come, we don't see it yet, but we know it will happen, because this God who reveals this is a truthful God, as he's already demonstrated. In 2 Corinthians 5:10, Paul warns us, for we shall all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. There's not an exception nowhere in this world, not in this room. Every one of us, young and old, will one day appear before God. That we must give an account of the things we've done in the body, whether good or bad. Language kind of echoing what the wise man says in Ecclesiastes. And in Romans 14 and verse 12, he gets very individualistic. So then, every one of us shall give account of himself to God. Now that's the first major message out of this simple study. Verse 9, rejoice in your youth, but know, realistically, a judgment is awaiting us all. And so, in view of that, he goes on to say in verse 10, therefore, remove sorrow from your heart. We were talking about that this morning. Heart is broader than, it's not the blood pump, physically speaking, as the Jews would use a term like that. The Hebrews, they would think of the innermost man, the part that thinks and wills and even feels, that intends and that has purposes and plans. That's the heart in the broadest sense. But remove evil from your heart, which means we can sometimes feel sick in our minds, sick in our emotions. And this is one of the saddest things we contemplate today, all around us, especially among the youth. But again, that's relative. Sometimes young adults, sometimes middle age, and even the elderly have to grapple with these kinds of issues. But the experts tell us, especially among our young people, something is happening. And today things are taking place that were not known very much as a common problem just a generation or so ago. He says, remove sorrow from your heart. This word sorrow means vexation, to be vexed. Really frustrated. Anger, grief, these are the meanings of this word that's translated here, vexation. Sorrow. Anything that disquiets the mind and the heart. In other words, we would call it something like anxiety. We might even go on to say it's neurosis, and even to the farthest point of being psychosis, and all those things sort of shade off into one another. In the inner man, in the heart, these things happen. The governing center of our individual being. We need to remove these things that cause sorrow and unhappiness. And what are those things? The bottom line biblically, as we all know who read our Bibles, is sin. It's an unpopular word, rarely heard outside the context of a church building setting. But it's still biblical, and it will never change, and it's applicable for every day and every setting. The number one problem of the human race is sin. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Romans 3:23. Now, we know the exception are the innocents. We're born innocent, not yet with the ability to choose good and evil. So we're not accountable because we don't understand yet what it means to choose good or evil. But there will come a time in our life when we do. And that age varies for every individual. Some are a little older, some are a little younger. But all eventually will reach the age, if we live, to know what's right and what's wrong. And I must do what's right and not do what's wrong. And yet we choose of our own free will to do wrong, even after we've come to that point of accountability for our actions. All have sinned, Romans 3:23. All have come short of the glory of God. So we've got to get rid of sin. And that's not just abstract. There are specific things that make me unhappy, that hurt my life and hurt my heart in that Hebrew sense of the term, like anger and jealousy, hatred toward others, which is harbored hatred toward others for a long period, lust, covetousness, pride. James discussed this whole phenomenon here in James chapter 4, verses 1 to 3, where he asks the question, from whence come wars and fightings among you? So he presupposes we have troubles. We don't get along with others. We don't get along even within ourselves. Many times there are conflicts within. From which come wars and fightings? Come they not hence from your lust, which war in your members? So you desire to have, and you can't get what you want. I want this, I want it, but I can't get it. So even he goes to say, sometimes you go even to the point of killing, taking another life to get it. But you still don't get it. Even if you go to the point of violence to get it, you don't get it. You don't get it because he says you don't ask for it. Well, whom do I ask? Obviously, God. He's talking about prayer. James has that in mind. But then it says, well, sometimes you do ask for it and you still don't get it. Why? Because you ask amiss that you may consume it upon your own lusts, selfishness, selfish desires, not in conformity to the will of God, your Creator. The wicked are like the troubled sea. We've seen this image a number of times in Isaiah 57, verses 20 and 21. I love to watch pictures of people fishing in the surf or at the side of the ocean, catching fish right out of the waves. But I also see how sometimes the sea, usually the Gulf of Mexico is what I watch, it's very churned up. There's a lot of seaweed and dirt. And that's vivid. The wicked are like the troubled sea when it cannot rest, whose waters cast up mire and dirt. There is no peace, saith my God, to the wicked. But I'm not wicked. I just sometimes don't do what I should. I sometimes cut a few corners morally, but I'm not wicked. But wickedness in the Bible is that which is contrary to God's will. It is thus sin. Get rid of these things that cause all these trouble. Look for happiness in the right places, not with friends who are just fair weather, not with popularity, not with fantasies, entertaining ideas that are false or not real. Get rid of these things that hurt your heart. But then he goes on to add, and put away evil from your flesh. That's your physical body. Those things kind of go hand in hand. Sometimes when we have these ideas in our minds and these anxiety, then suddenly our bodies begin to see the effects as well. This word evil, put away evil from your flesh, from your body. This word evil is not talking about moral responsibility, moral evil here. No, this has to do with something like calamity or misery. Take misery out of your body's life. It's that which is displeasing or even poisonous, noxious, that which is harmful. This is what the experts are warning us about today. What's going on with our young people? So many are caught up with the false philosophies of our time and the false, wrong attitudes of our time, doing harmful things to themselves. I didn't even realize it was a thing so bad until recently, studying about how in some cases, just a few years ago, it was a fad among young girls to starve themselves almost to death because they had this image that, well, I'm just a little too overweight. And the world is telling them these horrible things, lying to them. You've got to look like some sort of model in a book or some lying model picture we talked about earlier today in social media. That's not real. There's no one that really looks that way. You just keep losing weight. This is why this is kind of a thing. It's a fad, I think, for young girls to take pictures of filling up bowls of cereal and then pouring out the cereal in the sink and then going back taking pictures of the bowls. That came about from these coaches on the internet who were telling these young anorexic ladies, lie to your parents. Your mama may be at work. She may call up and say, have you eaten your breakfast? Oh yeah, here's the picture. That's where that came from. Funny, I know it's funny. But you know what? This idea of anorexia nervosa, I just got to get less and less. 70 pounds, that's too much. I got to get down to 65. And then these abusive adults, so-called coaches or influencers who get online and tell you ways to do that and to lose more. And then the idea that, well, why are we not weight affirming? Why don't we go and affirm them? If she says or if he says, I'm overweight, I'm just too fat, why don't we say, yes, you're right, you're too fat. You ought to call me fatty. My name is not so-and-so. Call me fatty. Yes? Okay, you're fatty. That's what you are. And you need to go and have liposuction. Right? You need to take your fat away. We need to put you on a diet right now and change the chemistry of your body. We think, how ridiculously irresponsible, how absurd. And young girls before were hurting themselves and others, a young boy, young girls especially. I'm too big. And taking sharp objects and cutting themselves. It's become a thing, cutting themselves, harming themselves. I don't like myself. I'm cutting myself. And then, of course, the latest craze, the same as the anorexia craze just a few years back, that of gender reassignment. I've got to reassign my gender. It's not the right one. Because I've been told that by my friends. I've been told that on the internet by these abusive adults too. These coaches, these influencers who are not telling us the truth. So I can bring all kinds of misery by entertaining false ideas, things that are not true. Oh, how we need to get our young people to see that God made us what we are. I'm made in the image of God, and I'm made by God. Psalm chapter 139 points out how He formed me in my mother's womb. I am what God wants me to be. I was made this way, a boy or a girl, and that's all God recognizes, and it's beautiful and wonderful within its own sphere, its own place. So put away evil from your flesh and all these false ideas. Why? Well, He says, notice this, childhood and youth are vanity. Ooh, this is not a criticism of being young. Can't help it when you're born. That's naturally what you are. You're young. What He's saying is, this word vanity here in this context means emptiness. We think of youth as the most valuable thing, but it isn't. Childhood and youth is empty. It's transitory. It's fleeting. It's temporal. It's frail. It's here today and it's soon gone. And then we are adults. And He says, so remove sorrow from your life. Remove evil from your flesh. And He goes on to say, verse 1 of chapter 12, here's how you do it. Remember now thy Creator. In the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, or when the evil days draw not nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. No pleasure in those days and no pleasure in those ideas about God anymore. Remember now thy Creator. Call it to mind. Deliberately think about, I'm made by God. And this implies I can easily forget. I've got to deliberately think. I can easily forget about God. How often do I think about God? Every day? Every hour of every day? I would hope we get into that habit, that it becomes our habit all of our lives. And we begin it especially in youth, when we're young. And all the days of your youth. This is now. This means today. And even if you're 65 years old, you're still young, relatively speaking. Today, it's never too late to start, to begin considering your Creator. Today is the day of salvation. 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 2. Today is the day. Exhort one another daily. Hebrews 3:13. Lest any of us be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 7. Today, if you will hear His voice, harden not your hearts, as in the provocation. Again, that's the constant emphasis. Now, today, this moment. Remember now. Remember what? Remember now your Creator, because you are at the risk of dying. You are at the risk of your life ending. And in our case, we know we are at the risk of the Lord returning at any moment, only known to God the Father. He could return to this earth and bring us into judgment at any moment. Remember now, therefore, and not be caught unprepared. Remember thy Creator. I wish we had more time to discuss this. We'll just remind ourselves of the information that's readily available. We know there's a Creator. This is not just make-believe. We know God exists. Think about it. The only two real alternatives would be atheism or belief in a higher power. And particularly we're thinking about God, but some higher power beyond this universe. Either this universe is it, there is no God, or there's much more to reality. Much, much more. And thus this universe was made by an intelligent being. Those are the real alternatives. I want to reiterate, those are the alternatives. We're talking about the binary issues this morning in class about right and wrong, either or, how logic is binary in that sense. So it is when it comes to this question, either God is or He is not. Either atheism is right or not. Now, atheism has to explain life. Atheism has to explain origins. There is no God, says the atheist. All right, how do we get here? He has to have an evolution story. Evolution, whether it's the Darwinian variety or ancient variety of the Greeks, evolution of some type, accidental development from physical stuff alone, pure chance, has to be the explanation. That is the creation story of atheism. Has to be. It's the creation myth of atheism. On the other hand, according to believers in the Bible, God made us in His image at the very beginning. Everything was created by God. Now, these are the alternatives. Why does that matter? Why do you keep bringing it up? I mentioned this a number of times. The implications are astounding. Evolution is the creation story of atheism. And atheism has to have a creation story. It has to explain how I got here, why I exist. But if evolution can be shown false, if evolution can be demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt to be wrong, it could not be the right explanation. Since atheism absolutely depends on evolution, atheism itself is proven wrong. And that leaves the only other alternative, God. And Genesis says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. I wish we had time to look at all the information. There's much out there. You wonder about the scientists. Who are the scientists who've set forth the information to show atheism can't be right because evolution is wrong? These are men I'm thinking about, and women, who are extremely well educated, who are courageous. These are men and women who've done research. They've spent all their lives in gathering these advanced degrees. Many days they're just sitting in the library reading and studying and writing, publishing. These are people who've earned their reputation, earned their credentials. And they're out telling us, for example, what the evolutionist says cannot be right about the organization of the first living molecules and the first DNA that gives the information that allows the molecules in the human body or any living form to be able to replicate itself, to reproduce. The information could not have happened by accident. They find out these things because they study, but then you say, well, yes, but science says evolution is the proper explanation. You see, the word science gets used loosely. A lot of times science is very political. It means what the establishment says you have to believe. The National Institute of Health, they're not going to give grants to people who are doing experimentation to show that Darwin was wrong. They just won't do it because, politically speaking, for so long, evolution has become the official dogma of these major governmental organizations, or the American Association for Science. There are many different organizations that are official that politically say you can't believe in anything but evolution. But many of their members do dissent. Secretly, they don't accept it. And when they publish, when they come out, usually they're quashed, but not always. Sometimes they can get away with it. Sometimes they can get this material into print, and we find it. Oh, it may be a minority point of view in a sense, but the minority has never determined, or majority, what's right. And the minority is not wrong just for being in the minority. These scientists point out that geological features in our world, such as the fossil record, indicate there was a sudden explosion at some time in the past of all the major life forms we know today. That fits perfectly with the creation account. It does not fit at all the gradualistic account that's demanded by forms of Darwinism or evolutionism. The atheist story. You have the chemistry involved in the human body, in all living things, that just would not be explicable. You cannot explain it apart from design. So I'm saying the evidence is there. There are many experts who do not agree with Darwinism, many more than we realize a lot of times. They're quite silent because if they do publish, they lose their positions teaching or writing or whatever. But there are many who are bold, and they will say what needs to be said. I'm reminding us, God exists. If there were no God, there would be no right and no wrong. How does that follow? Because only the will of God can determine what's right and wrong. If everything is relative, then of course Adolf Hitler was right to exterminate millions of Jewish people just because of their race. That was right for Hitler, relatively speaking. You couldn't say Hitler was wrong. What standard did he violate? He didn't violate the laws of Germany because he made the laws of Germany when he was in power. And the laws of Germany said kill Jewish people. That was the law in Germany. Somebody says, oh, but that was against the laws of the Allies. Well, the Allies' laws, Britain and France and United States, for example, Canada, our laws didn't apply in Germany. They didn't apply within the four corners of that nation. So that's not the explanation. Somebody says it was international law. But as the French prosecutor at Nuremberg pointed out, it couldn't be just international law. It had to be a higher law. International law could change. International law could say, okay, Hitler, okay, you Nazis, you're all right. We'll just let it go. You can kill all the Jews you want. And by the way, how many millions more killed under communism? Millions more under Stalin. Millions more under Chairman Mao in China. Millions more in many other countries, Cambodia, for example. So I'm saying right and wrong has to be based upon an objective standard, not merely subjective what I feel like. Hitler felt like Jews ought to be killed. Hitler was wrong. And all such people are wrong because they do not recognize the objective moral law. If I ever say, hey, that's not fair, I was in line first and you broke in line, I'm suddenly secretly recognizing there's such a thing as morality. It's not right to break in line. Just about everybody recognizes that, by the way. Things like that, so simple, so everyday. We are human and we recognize right and wrong. Why? How explain it? In the beginning, God. We are made in His image. So we look at how evolution can be shown wrong. It's scientifically false. We look at philosophically how there's only one way to explain good and evil, the will of God. Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not. I wish we had time to look into all this. These evil days here are really interesting to read about. Verse 2, while the sun or the light or the moon or the stars be not darkened or the clouds return after the rain. Commentators say this is kind of weird. It's a mixture of figures of speech, metaphors, and literal language. A mixture back and forth. He's talking about how it feels when you get old. And we can relate. In the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble. The keepers of the house. Maybe your bones, maybe your arms and your legs. You see, it's a figure of speech, but it's referring to our bodies as they become old and decrepit. And the strong men shall bow themselves. That's a figure, but it refers to how our bodies gets weak. And the grinders cease because they are few. This is a feminine word. Grinders used to be, there were women who worked for. This is like the metaphor of a mansion. It's an estate. It's an estate that's falling into dilapidation. That's the metaphor. It's our life. It's my body. So there are grinders who grind the meal so that I have something to eat, but then there are fewer and fewer. And evidently it refers to our teeth. Our teeth are grinders and they get few. And as you get older, you begin to lose them. And those that look out the windows be darkened. Again, that's a feminine form. It refers to the women who in this estate would have the time to look out the windows. I look through the window of my eyes. Very likely he's referring to the windows of our eyes. And the door shall be shut in the streets. Some have thought that's our mouths. We lose our teeth and our cheeks sort of draw up on our mouths. When the sound of the grinding is low, you don't hear as well when you get older. And he shall rise up with the voice of the bird. It's hard to sleep in the morning when the birds start chirping, especially the older you get. And all the daughters of music shall be brought low. You can't hear that beautiful music as well. And when they shall be afraid of that which is high. I was scared of my tractor. I thought I was going to fall in the creek yesterday. Now, it's not because I'm 65. It's because I was on a slick hill. But I'm afraid to fall. The older you get, the more likely it is you'll break a bone if you fall. And the almond tree shall flourish. The almond tree was the first tree that flourished in their day and time. And it was very white, covered in white bloom. It refers to our white hair. And the grasshopper shall be a burden. Some have thought this is the little grasshopper bug that as it gets old can barely walk. And it's a metaphor for us. And desire shall fail because man goeth to his long home. And the mourners go about the street. We will go to our long home sooner or later. And if there are people still on this earth, the mourners will go about the street. What is my life now? Am I living for God every moment? Am I ready to meet God? Have I had my sins washed away? Today, there's only one way to do that. Through the blood of Jesus Christ. And the blood of Christ is only contacted, only in the act of obedience, which is my supreme faith, when I am baptized for the remission of my sins. Having repented of wrong and been willing to confess Him before others, I'm baptized and wash away my sins. And youth is the best time, but youth is relative. If I'm in my 50s or 60s, it's still not too late. It's time for me to rejoice in my youth and to remove sorrow and evil from my heart and from my flesh, and to remember now my Creator. If you need to come forward and let us know about your desire to be baptized or to confess wrong as an erring child of God, let us know while together we stand and we sing.